thrilled to welcome him here today to talk to us about substance misuse. James, I think it'd be best if we start off with you just telling anybody who's watching who you are and why you're here, answering these questions and talking to us today.
Excellent. Thanks, Tammy. And yes, so thank you for asking me to come along. So I'm James, and my background really is working within the substance misuse sector, which I've done for, I guess, around about 20 years or so. Kind of got into it through volunteering in a kind of local community drug service, and have been doing the work ever since. Currently work for a kind of national charity that's involved in substance misuse treatment. And alongside that, I do training work for TAY and for various other organisations as well. So that's kind of me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, James. Been around a while, working with people with complex needs and substance misuse issues. I think you've trained for TAY for just before the pandemic. I think you had your first session because you did start off by delivering face to face for us and delivering substance misuse and complex needs sessions. And the role that you currently undertake for the national charity, what does that specifically entail?
So I currently work carrying a caseload of people who are in substance misuse treatment, a variety of different substances that people are using, kind of right across the spectrum. And I'm also moving into delivering outreach work, which is going to be mostly involved in the distribution of naloxone, which is the heroin opioid overdose antidote, and working within pharmacy needle and syringe programs and delivering training to staff who are delivering the pharmacy needle exchanges. So a varied role at the moment, I guess.
You
Yeah.
know, what's really funny about that, James, is I know the questions that are on the list, and I already want to ask you about 10 different questions just from how you explained your role. So I'm going to try and hold myself back. But as we go through this session, I might sneak a few questions in there that I'm particularly interested in based on what you've just said there.
Excellent.
Um, but for anybody that doesn't know, for anybody who's here watching this Ask Me Anything for the first time, we run through a quite an informal format, really. So we have across our social media platforms asked people to send questions in advance and told them a little bit about James and what his area of expertise is. And so we do have a whole host of questions that we've been sent in advance. But equally, if you're watching this live, then you're very welcome to ask questions within the community group. And I will be looking at those, and I will ask James those as we go through the session, so you can absolutely interact. And if you're watching this after the session and you would like to ask any further questions, you can post those in the Facebook group, or you can email them into us at inquiries at training number 4 influence.co.uk. So a variety of ways for you to get involved. Hopefully we'll get through all of the questions that we've been sent in, and we will do our absolute best, and I will try not to take us off onto tracks that I'm really interested in too much. So James, are you ready to go for us?
Yeah. So where are we going to, Tammy? What's the next question?
So I'm going to start off, if that's okay, because some of these questions connect together, and you might answer them together, and some of them are really quite distinctively different. So, but one of the first ones that was sent in to us was some people seem to use drugs and continue a normal life, and some don't. What's the difference?
So I guess people who use drugs in whole kind of different ways. And so exactly as the question kind of asks, yeah, some people can be using substances. They can have a relationship with substances that doesn't cause them too many problems. It's just an aspect of the life alongside lots of other stuff that they've got going on, and their substance use is just an aspect of what they do. So that's kind of recreational drug use, as we might call it. And people who use drugs recreationally essentially make up the bulk of people who use drugs. Most people are using in a way that isn't really causing them massive issues in their day-to-day functioning.
That's actually really interesting when you say that, because that's not where our minds go. Do you know, if we think immediately of drug users, immediately our minds go to people who are struggling using drugs. And I know obviously we'll be talking quite a lot more about this in detail, about people who struggle, about service users that you work with and your experience. But in your experience, is there anything that makes the difference? Because we hear a lot about trauma and we hear a lot about circumstance and poverty and such like. Is there anything in your experience that makes that difference between that recreational drug use and then that where drug use becomes a problem?
So I think what you outlined there, Tammy, is what a lot of the current thinking is, isn't it? That addiction, dependency, whatever kind of term you want to use, is when people have formed a relationship with substances, often because of lots of other stuff that's gone on in their life, and childhood trauma, adverse life experiences are increasingly kind of recognised to sort of be major contributing factors. Poverty, deprivation, and general life circumstances where, for whatever reason, there isn't much else going on for that person, and a lot of what they are doing is focused around obtaining, using, recovering from the effects of substances. So I guess maybe the line is where, for many people, is where that shifts, is where the life goes from having other stuff, other activity, other stuff that they've got going on, to where the focus is more on substance use. So yeah, there's all those kind of factors in people's lives. Some people talk about maybe like some kind of genetic sort of predisposition that maybe leads to addiction. There's the psychosocial factors. There's all these different kind of theories around why people develop problems with drugs. Which one is the right answer is for me is still the kind of big question. And if we knew that, we'd have the answer to lots of people's kind of problems. And I think it's that complex interaction between lots of different factors that leads people to develop that kind of problematic relationship.
Do you know what's really interesting there, James, is that you've said so many different things there that could take us off down rabbit holes, and so I'm really like you deliver a full day's course, don't you, on complex needs and substance misuse. So we're not going to cover this kind of in an hour. But what's really interesting there is that you just used a term that I've never really considered before, and it's really resonated with me. And you said form a relationship with substances. That's we just I'm not doing very good at not taking us off, so just in like 30 seconds, could you tell us what you mean by form a relationship with substances, because that's a really interesting term.
Yes, for me, and after working with people who've got dependency or addiction for many years, it is a relationship and sometimes it's the longest lasting relationship in a person's life. Maybe families fallen out with them, partners left, friends have died or moved on, but that substance that's been there with them is still there, and it's a really powerful kind of bond. And I think, when some people move away from using substances, they go through that whole kind of grieving process. They've lost a massive part of their life, which, for maybe looking from the outside might have caused all kinds of issues for them. But, like all relationships, it's complicated. And, there's positives to people's substance use, even when it can be causing them problems. They're still either getting something good out of it or it's stopping something bad from happening.
That's yeah. That really kind of resonates, and that's really powerful stuff, because quite often we forget, or we don't want to think about the good that substances are bringing to somebody's life. Of course, that you can be pulled into a vortex where things are fundamentally negative connected to using substances. that actually people wouldn't use substances at all if they weren't getting something from it. And like you had said at the beginning, you know, there are people that use substances and maintain kind of their, I guess, their normal, in inverted, kind of safe, secure, positive societal life. And then there are people that use substances and it absolutely impacts them negatively, significantly in multiple ways. But actually, one of the things that's a similarity across that is that both groups of people will be attributing something positive to taking those substances.
Absolutely.
So James, we've got a couple of questions that kind of link into what we've said there, and one of them, you know, I'm going to pull us into kind of, I guess, substance misuse that has a negative impact on people's lives, because your experience really kind of sits within helping people who are in kind of crisis mode. Really, do you know, if they're in treatment, they're trying to recover, they're going through that process, and then, as you said, some of that kind of resettlement work, and you talked about heroin dependency and things. So I want to just pull us in without kind of, like, with recognising the fact that there's multi layers to substance misuse, and of course there are lots of different people within different parts of life and society that use substances in a variety of ways. If you don't mind, I'm going to kind of focus us a little bit more on your experience. And also, a lot of the people who are in the Training for Influence community are frontline professionals in places like probation. So we've got Nina watching. Hi, Nina. Within schools, we've got Becky watching. Within police, we've got Karen watching. Do you know? So we've got people who work with service users on the front line. So talking specifically about your kind of service users, so people who are struggling and are going through treatment, we have a question that is kind of really, really generalistic, but it says, what are drug users like? Is everyone you see the same? Because we tend to lump that group of people in together, don't we?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess my thoughts around what our drug use is like is just to say what are people like, because you know, people of all kinds of different people use drugs. But yeah, you know, thinking about the people who we see within treatment services who have usually got more problematic use. Again, there's a whole range of people who come through treatment services. If I think broadly about my kind of experience, I would say that it kind of varies depending what substances you're talking about. So, for example, most people using heroin in the service that I work in, and kind of generally across the country, tend to be older. You know, they tend to be people in the mid to late 40s, early 50s, or older, and they're really the remnants, if you like, of the kind of late 80s, early 90s kind of generation who got into using, who are still using now, and they're the ones who haven't given up, who have still got a relationship with the substance. You know, they haven't died as a result of use, and they're still doing it. And you know, some obviously are moving into recovery, but I guess many of that generation are, you know, they've been using heroin for a long time, for a significant portion of their lives. So that makes up, you know, quite a significant number of people who come through treatment services. We don't see many younger heroin users. You know, it's quite unusual for younger people to use heroin, although they are out there. And then, you know, across other substances, well, it completely varies. You know, we see people from all walks of life who've got problems with drugs, or, you know, and when I talk about drugs, obviously I'm including alcohol within that as well. You know, so it's not uncommon to see much older drinkers, people who have got into alcohol use late in life. Maybe they've been drinking all their life, but as a result of a late kind of life experience like bereavement or retirement, and people's relationship with alcohol can become much more of a problem. So you know, we see quite a lot of older sort of drinkers through services. Cocaine tends to be, you know, younger people. 30s, early 40s, maybe kind of working, stuff like that, but their use has become a bit of an issue. So it varies, and treatment services are increasingly seeing, I guess, more people using cannabis as well, which again can vary across kind of age range and different sort of demographics, really.
That's really interesting because as you've been saying that visually, I've kind of seen, I guess, blocks of generations. And you've talked about kind of the I guess the 40s and 50s. And I turned 41 this week, and I kind of think back to my days as a teenager living in homeless hostels. And absolutely, heroin was the drug of choice at that point.
Mm,
Do you know, it was in homeless hostels, it was rife at that point. When I'm thinking of the people that I was living with, generally it was 16 to 19-year-old lads that were getting into heroin. But we're
mhm.
talking now back in, gosh, 96, 97, 98.
Yeah,
So of course they're going to be your 40 and 50-year-olds now, aren't they?
absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And obviously, unfortunately, we've got increasing numbers of that kind of generation, if you like, dying from overdose deaths. We've got the highest rates of drug deaths on record in England, in Scotland at the moment. So, more and more people are dying from overdose. So I forget the exact number, but
Is that overdose from
I
heroin
think it's
use?
last year.
Sorry, James, I lost you just for a
Yeah,
second
yeah,
there.
yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, I think it cut out. Yeah.
Um, so Nina has commented in the Facebook group just saying, and Nina's a probation officer, and she says she agrees regarding heroin users' age. It was a lot more common in her line of work back in 2005.
Mm,
I'm not sure if
absolutely.
Nina's old enough to have been working in 2005, but but yeah, it completely concurs with my experience as well. Tell me a little bit, like you talked about older people there, and you talked about drink. And that's interesting because you, in your language, immediately you're talking about it within the same breath as drugs. But actually, within society, we love to separate, don't we? We love to kind of socially accept drinking and not to accept drugs. But you're talking about them in the same breath as somebody who works within treatment services. Why do you connect them together in that way?
I guess because of the reason you said, because we do separate them. And I think when we talk about drugs, we've got to have honest conversations about drugs, and we can't have honest conversations about drugs if we separate alcohol and tobacco out and don't really talk about them as drugs. And that's where we all come into conversations around drugs with a lot of baggage. We've grown up in this society where certain substances are vilified. People who use them are often stigmatized and marginalized. So people come to these conversations with all kinds of, I guess, preconceptions around, what drugs are, who uses them, and what drugs are about. But exactly as you say, alcohol is kind of separated out of that. Was moving a little bit and becoming, kind of a lot more kind of stigmatized and socially unacceptable in a way. But alcohol is the drug that most people have a relationship with. And, it's sometimes said that it's the only drug that people have to justify why they're not using it. So, people don't drink alcohol. People often want to know why and assume there's been a problem. So yeah, if we're going to have a serious conversations around drugs, we have to talk about drugs and recognize alcohol, tobacco, and include them in that conversation. And I think it helps people kind of understand drugs a little better in a way.
Yeah, do you know that made me chuckle a little bit because I don't drink. I might occasionally have a peach schnapps, but I'm a bit of a wuss with drinking. And when if on the occasion kind of I go out pre-pandemic, if people say, "Oh, can I buy you a drink?" and I'll just say, "Can I have a Diet Coke, please?" Do you know 90% of people raise their eyebrows, and I have to go, "I just don't really like it." Do you know? But I've never thought of that before. You have,
Mm,
to an extent, you have to justify not using it.
mm.
And I've never thought before either what you just said there about kind of trigger points for older people potentially. You mentioned seeing people who've kind of recently retired and such like.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think I mean, the aging population of people we've got using drugs is a challenge for society and the treatment sector anyway. Generally people in treatment are getting older. We've got this aging opioid using population. People aren't stopping using drugs in the same way as we might kind of assume, where we think it's something people do when they're younger and then they give up. Some people, that's the case. They mature out of drug use, their life changes, they get into circumstances where, they've got to get up and take the kids to school or whatever, so they don't use drugs. But, increasingly we're seeing people and carry on using drugs. So we're going to see older and older people having issues with all drugs. But in terms of alcohol, exactly because of the long-term use of alcohol that people have in that relationship where it is very normalized. But then, yeah, late life kind of significant events like bereavement, like retirement, loss of role, taking on a caring role, all these kind of things that are challenges for older people can often be a kind of a trigger for a relationship with alcohol to become more of a problem. And I guess when we talk about older people, there's a whole kind of what do we mean when we talk about older people as well within that. It's a growing issue for sure. And certainly in my experience, I've seen a lot of that over recent years, kind of, guys in the sort of late 70s who've got into drinking as a result of bereavement, caring roles, it's pretty common.
Yeah, and actually, as you're saying it, I can imagine it as well, and I can see absolutely how that's happened.
Mm,
Particularly when we reflect on the fact that, as you've said, they might have had a relatively positive or completely positive relationship with alcohol throughout their life,
mm.
and it is socially acceptable to drink. So actually, those two together with something like a triggering event, you can see why it would happen, can't you?
Yeah. It's and a lot of those kind of older drinkers can kind of move away from drinking with a few sessions, a bit of advice around safer drinking levels, putting some rules and boundaries in place around drinking, and a lot of older drinkers can be really kind of receptive to that sort of brief intervention sort of approach where it's maybe 3 or 4 kind of brief sessions of advice and information, and they're able to kind of move away and make pretty positive changes to get to what they'd feel is a more controlled kind of way of drinking.
That's interesting because that's quite different to heroin users who have potentially had a 30-year relationship, for 30 years potentially negative relationship with heroin, and now I guess I'm assuming from your comment earlier about the work that you're now moving into in the community. But actually, if you're looking at blockers and things like that, actually the addiction is quite entrenched, isn't it?
In terms of what do you mean by blockers, Tammy? In terms of treatment like naltrexone and stuff?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, so well, naltrexone is a possible treatment option for people, and that's uh, what would be known as a blocker, which stops the opioids sort of working on the brain, so people can't use substances on top of that. I think what I mentioned was naloxone, which is different because naloxone is the opioid antidote. So naloxone is this stuff, which some of you might have seen. So it's a 2 ml syringe in these yellow boxes that contains the opioid antidote, and these are distributed through substance misuse treatment services, through harm reduction services, and the aim is to give them and get them into the hands of people who use drugs and anyone who might come into contact with people who use drugs, so they can intervene in an opioid overdose. So similar names but different actions. Naltrexone is the blocker. Naloxone is the opioid antagonist that kind of kicks the opioids off the brain receptors. And by doing that, if somebody has overdosed, it kind of reverses the respiratory depression that kills people during overdose. So it temporarily throws the opioids off, so people's breathing kind of comes back and they come out of that overdose. So these kits, if you are a professional, approach your local kind of drug services. If you come into
Yes.
contact with people using drugs and say, can we get an naloxone kit, and get some training from a harm reduction worker in your local area for sure. It's really crucial that we get naloxone out.
Just very slowly and steadily hold it up to your camera because when you're moving, you
I'm
can't
kind of
quite
waving it.
see.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry. Um, so Um, so yeah, so this is naloxone. And it contains, as I say, a 2 ml syringe, two long blue needles, and an instruction leaflet. And if you came across somebody who had experienced opioid overdose, so pinpoint pupils, a blue tinge to the lips or fingers, a grayish pallor or complexion, shallow or no breathing, unresponsive, so you can't rouse them by saying the name or shaking the shoulder, and maybe floppy limbs as well. If you came across somebody who was in that state, that's an opioid overdose. So by opening one of these packs, putting the needle on the syringe, putting it into the muscle on the leg, and injecting them with 5 doses marked on the syringe in that box, and you give them a dose. If they weren't breathing, you'd give CPR. Obviously, you'd called an ambulance already, and the ambulance would be on the way. And then those 5 doses should be enough to bring somebody out of an overdose and reverse that breathing. But it's only temporary. So the effects of the opioid they've taken will come back after about half an hour or so. So it's really important, if you did administer it, to try and keep that person there until the paramedics arrive, because they'll be in withdrawal. It's kicked the opioids off the brain receptors, so they're going to be rattling. They're going to be feeling those withdrawal symptoms. So, they're going to be, disorientated. They're not going to have known that they've been overdosing, and they're not going to really know maybe what's happening. So you want to reassure them and explain that the effects of naloxone are only temporary, and that they'll only be in those withdrawals for about 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and then the opioids will be back on the brain receptor. But the risk is, if people go off and use at that point, they could then overdose for a second time. So naloxone is really important in the I guess, the fight against drug-related deaths, and trying to bring those numbers of people who are dying down.
James, you well, I'm going to say you clearly because this, but I'm going to check with you first. Do you by any chance deliver training on that? Because
I kind of do, yeah. I've done a bit of it, yeah. I might have gone into training mode there, I think, yeah.
Yeah, well, clear and really kind of explaining it. So that for me, that's quite mind blowing, because I was unfortunate enough to be around some heroin overdoses when I was in my younger years. And I've seen numerous deaths from heroin overdoses, none which were nice or pretty, and which really kind of stay with you. And that wasn't the people in the hostel that I worked within, they were there with us kind of shouting for the ambulance and things. They were as devastated as we were. I have no doubt that if they had training and this was available, I have no doubt that they would have been using it probably a good few times a week. So I do that's something that's quite new to me. So I really do implore, if you are a frontline professional, go and ask your organisation about it. And see whether you can get on some training and get access to say it again, naloxone.
Naloxone, yeah, absolutely. It's like you say, Tammy. There are people are dying. Those people in the past. If we'd had naloxone then, they'd still be around. And like I've known many people who've died through opioid overdose. Working in Barnsley for nearly 20 years. Unfortunately, I can. There's a lot of people we've lost. Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And seamlessly, you answered one of the questions that had been sent in, which was, what do I do if somebody overdoses? So, there you go. We stayed on track without even trying to stay on track. We've got a couple of comments in the Facebook group, so I'm just going to read out a few of those, if that's okay with you, James. So you talked a little bit about older people and drinking, and then we talked kind of about 40s, 50s and opioid use and such like. We haven't quite touched on the 30s-ish use yet, but we'll come back to that. But we've had a couple of comments. So Nina, who is the probation officer, says that she is old enough to have been around in 2005. Thanks, Nina. And that Mamba spice use seems to be more prevalent for a lot of service users at the moment. I'm not going to ask you to reply until I've gone through a couple of these, and then we'll kind of connect it together if that's okay. So Jo says that she sees more of the silver canisters around and the balloons. And I asked what she means by that. And Becky said, I used to see them all the time when I was working in children's homes and also when supporting young people around domestic abuse. When I was working in child sexual exploitation, we had a real high number of young people using MDMA. And then we have Molly, who says, I second that. I'm 23 and it's highly common that people use canisters for a quick high in combination with alcohol. I'm going to pause there. Oh no, actually, I'm going to say these two because these two are linked as well. So, and then Molly goes on to say in another one, drug culture for me as a young person is closely associated with all nightlife. Festivals, for example, it's very common. And Nina says alcohol is linked to more problematic behaviour than all other substances in her experience and more difficult to work with at times. And actually, I've got more comments, but I'm going to come back because I bet you're dying to come into a few of those.
Oh, some great comments, and yeah, there's loads we could talk about around that, isn't there? The canisters, I guess, so that's nitrous oxide, more commonly known as laughing gas. A lot of people call it nods, and well, it's kind of been kind of in the news recently, hasn't it? Because Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, has kind of announced that she wants to kind of clamp down on the use of nitrous oxide. So it's a very short-lasting kind of buzz for people a sense of euphoria. Obviously, as the name suggests, it makes them laugh a lot. And used through a balloon, it's the classic kind of harm reduction strategy, because transferring it from those metal canisters, which, you know, would be really dangerous to inhale from one of those, it can freeze your lips, it's high kind of pressure gas. Putting it into a balloon and inhaling from the balloon means that, you know, if you maybe passed out or something like that, the balloon's going to fall out of your mouth, you're going to breathe in, the oxygen is going to displace the nitrous, so there's no kind of risk. If somebody stole a surgical canister with a mask on and kind of strapped it on and turned the canister on, then it'd be quite dangerous because they could potentially overdose and it could be potentially fatal for them. So using through a balloon and being sat down in case you get dizzy and fall over and kind of bang your head, that's the classic kind of ways of reducing the risk of nitrous. And it's increasingly popular among young people. And I guess there's a few interesting reasons. So younger women often say they prefer it to alcohol because they feel less vulnerable under the effects of it. The effects are very short lasting, only a few minutes, pretty much sober after about half an hour. So compare that to alcohol, where people can get very intoxicated and potentially find themselves in quite dangerous and risky situations. It's often talked about as being preferred. A lot of people feel they're able to drive after using nitrous oxide, because if you wait maybe an hour or so after using, it's kind of out of your system, you're not impaired. So you could get in your car and drive home or whatever. So many young people might prefer it to alcohol and other drugs for that reason as well. And yeah, you know, it's become, you know, really kind of popular. You know, large numbers of people using it. Kind of sits outside the laws in a way, because although it's controlled under the Psychoactive Substances Act for use as an intoxicant, you can still buy those canisters because they're used in all kinds of catering products. So it's I guess the last of those kind of drugs that maybe sits outside legislation. Obviously, most of the legal highs that we remember have been kind of banned under the Psychoactive Substances Act, and then the Misuse of Drugs Act controls all of the traditional illegal drugs we'll know about, like cannabis or cocaine or MDMA.
Just rewind for a sec to nitrous oxide. So you told us kind of the reasons why people might choose it, particularly younger people, for, you know, accessibility, affordability, like you said, the short term, the short term impact of it, and the control and such like. What are the negative impacts of nitrous oxide? What could happen?
So, you know, there's a potential for dependency. If people got into kind of heavy sort of daily use, it's not very common to see people dependent on nitrous oxide. Certainly, it's not something that substance misuse services see very much at all. there is one group of people in society where there's some kind of research that suggests they're maybe slightly higher risk of dependency, and that's probably not a group that you might think of. So that's often talked about as being like the dental profession, because they have access to a lot of nitrous oxide. So there's some kind of
Oh,
research
that's
around
interesting,
that.
isn't it?
Yeah, if you got dependent, one of the potential risks is vitamin B12 deficiency, which can manifest as like kind of fatigue and kind of aching and kind of sort of aching limbs. That can happen when people form a more dependent relationship. And there is a risk of death, if you use it in a dangerous way, like if you strapped a canister on your face and turned it on and took a whole surgical canister, or if you filled a carrier bag and put that on your head and put your head inside it and breathed it in, you could die of asphyxiation. But for the vast majority of people, nitrous is a fairly low risk substance to use, and that's what makes it so appealing to many people.
Do you think that's one of the reasons that, because we're talking about like different ages and different generations and things like that? Do you think that's one of the reasons that younger people are not necessarily reaching out, or some groups of younger people are not necessarily reaching out for some of the more traditional addictive drugs?
Yeah, I guess I suppose if you think of a drug like heroin and think about what a lot of young people might think about heroin, and people who use heroin will all know the kind of stigma that's around heroin use. They're not a group who are looked up to by a lot of young people. They're not going to be, a group that they want to aspire to be like. We know all the kind of derogatory names that's around people who use heroin. So yeah, that stigma around the drug maybe means that people don't want to experiment with it. They've seen what's happened to older people in their communities who use heroin, so they don't want to go down that route. But I guess drugs kind of often driven by kind of cultural trends as well. So drugs ebb and flow in popularity, and we're certainly seeing what's being called like the third wave of psychedelics. There's an increasing kind of interest in psychedelic use by a lot of younger people. There's a real interest in the potential of psychedelics for mental health treatments. So all of that's kind of combining, and we're certainly seeing it. We're hearing a lot more about things like DMT, LSD, magic mushrooms. All of those are becoming increasingly popular among some groups of people as well. There's real kind of interest in that.
I was going to say, because they're the ones that I associate with heroin to an extent, because going back to kind of my teenage years, people would use psychedelics like LSD for uppers, then they would use amphetamines for their rush, and then they would use things like heroin to bring them back down, and then they would go in a full circle all the way round again. So it's interesting that you say that actually psychedelics are actually make it potentially kind of becoming popular again, but heroin isn't. And actually, to an extent, I guess society has done a reasonably good job of putting off younger people from drugs like heroin by the way that it is presented, because we are all influenced by kind of what's around us. And it's Alex comments, which brings us really nicely on to about cocaine, because she said, so Alex, I'm going to take a bit of a guess at your age here. I want to say mid to late 20s. I might be completely wrong. So Alex, please tell me. But she says, it always shocks me the amount of people I know who use cocaine frequently and don't consider it an addiction. And then Becky says, cocaine always seemed to be the drug of choice of those I know as well. A lot of old school and college friends used it or still use it, and many don't see it as an addiction. And then Nina's replied, the link between partying on weekends using cocaine, alcohol, and deterioration in mental health can't be ignored either. And Alex is 29. Woohoo! That's perfect. So talk to us a little bit about kind of, I guess, that age group and cocaine use and I guess and amphetamines.
Yeah, well, I think like the questions have said, there's increasing use of cocaine. Cocaine is normalized in many kind of different areas of society. There's much better supply of cocaine into the UK now than there ever has been. that cocaine is generally purer and better quality. So more and more people are maybe moving from other stimulant drugs, maybe like amphetamines, and making that transition over to powder cocaine use. We're also seeing, I guess, as a result of that, the kind of social acceptability of crack use, which is often seen as a bit more of a hardcore drug, I guess, in some ways. More and more people maybe seeing that smoking crack isn't different to them than having a few lines of cocaine. So we're beginning to see that boundary between kind of powder cocaine and crack use shifting in some groups at least. But yeah, cocaine is everywhere. If you go into, I don't know, a working men's club, where I live, you might find 3 generations of people using cocaine. There might be the grandson, the dad, and the granddad all in the toilet cubicle using cocaine together. And I guess, going back to those questions, not everybody's use of cocaine is going to be an addiction. If somebody's using just at weekends and they're out and it's maybe, 2 or 3 times a month, I guess it's important not to recognize that as a dependency or addiction. But certainly when cocaine can become a problem for people, it can cause real issues. It's more usual to see cocaine used in like binge type patterns where people might use for a period of time, maybe 3 or 4 days, maybe start on a Friday night, go all the way through the weekend, miss work on Monday because they're still using coke, and go through a lot of money over that period of time, maybe £300-500, something like that. Wouldn't be uncommon for some people to do in a binge type session of cocaine. And then, within the nighttime economy, cocaine alongside alcohol is really widespread. And that can cause problems for people because when you combine those 2 drugs together, they combine within the body and form a third drug called copoethylene, which is kind of more toxic and more damaging than either alcohol or cocaine on its own.
Hang on. You're going to have to go back and repeat that last sentence, because that, again, another thing that has just kind of blown my mind a little bit there. So I've always known that coke and alcohol are dangerous. I've read about it, heard about it, etc. And obviously kind of uppers and downers and things like that and all the mixtures. But you've just come up with like an actual name and an actual definition. Go back and repeat that and tell us a little bit more about what that actually means.
So when people drink alcohol and they are using cocaine alongside it, obviously snort the cocaine, they drink the alcohol, all goes into the body, all going to be processed through the liver. But during that process, the metabolites of the alcohol and the cocaine, as they're being metabolized in the liver, they combine together to form this compound, this third compound called copoethylene, which is kind of a more damaging and more toxic substance to the body than either alcohol or cocaine on its own. Although those 2 substances kind of go together within, we'll all, if you think any movie you see, people are snorting coke, there's a bottle of champagne alongside it, it goes together like, I don't know, crackers and cheese for some people, but actually the risk of that is fairly significant. And I think it's important to note as well, when we talk about drug deaths, the deaths from cocaine are rocketing. We had nearly 800 cocaine related deaths last year, which is, it's been going up every year for about the last 5 or 6 years, from what I understand.
Wow, that's a lot.
Mm.
And when you're talking as well, like we talked about the different things coming in waves and generations and other things coming back out in popularity. And then you kind of then went boom, but cocaine goes across all of them. And then when you described heroin users and the way that society views heroin users, and then your description there of a cocaine user, you're talking about a bottle of champagne and partying the night away there, which of course it is more tempting than struggling and being homeless and such like that you might. So it's interesting the role society plays in actually encouraging or preventing substance misuse. And then going back to what you've said there is you've just given us a really amazing kind of explanation of how when these 2 combine, the impact they have. Yet that's not what we hear anywhere else. I've not heard that before, and I keep my ears to the ground and listen, working within this sector. I'd like to think that I'm not completely green as grass, and And of course, I know about drugs mixing and such like, as a general idea, it's never good. But actually, it seems to me that there's more that should be done about raising awareness, because if that is where the drugs deaths are rocketing, and if we've then got multi generations, that means our young people of today are still reaching for cocaine.
Yeah, I mean, well, drugs are always going to be popular. People like to use drugs. People enjoy the effect of drugs. We live in a drug using society, and it's certainly true to say less young people use drugs now than previous generations. And there's quite a lot of research to kind of suggest that. But on the flip side of that, drug use is increasingly normalized, and it might be that younger people are making choices maybe not to drink alcohol. Like about 25% of under 25s are alcohol free, but maybe they want to, microdose psychedelics now and again, or smoke cannabis instead, and they don't want to use alcohol. So again, it goes back to that thing around, we need to have serious conversations about drugs, and we need to recognize that people like to use drugs, and we need to really, as a society, in my view, I guess, start to think about moving away from the criminalization of people who use drugs, and move to a better system, because the majority of the problems caused by drugs stem from the prohibition. It's the prohibition that causes the real harm. If someone who is dependent on heroin had access to a clean diamorphine kind of supply that wasn't street heroin cut with all kind of adulterants, yeah, they'd still be dependent, but the harm from the use of that would be far less than the harms from the street drugs and the criminalization and the kind of lifestyle that can go along with that. So, we need to do better as society around drugs, because the way things are at the moment, it's really just resulting in increasing harms for people across the spectrum. So, we mentioned festivals and MDMA. We're seeing more and more young people dying because they want to go and take a pill and party. We can't allow that to continue as a society. MDMA is a really low risk substance if it's used in the right dose. Without adulterants. It's the prohibition that causes that dangerous market that young people are exposed to.
Yeah, yeah, and I completely agree, and I think the criminality that's attached to it, and the increasing cost, the danger that you might need to put yourself in to access those substances, all of those things increase risk dramatically. And I'm of the age where I remember when there was the kind of the petition to be allowed to test ecstasy on the way into clubs. And ecstasy was still illegal. But it was allowed as you passed into clubs, in certain areas, that it was tested to see whether it had been cut with anything. And actually that slight intervention around that time where ecstasy was causing the most drug-related deaths in young people, saved hundreds and thousands of lives. So I agree with you, but I think it's a different Ask Me Anything that we go into about actually the harm that drugs cause, and how much is that down to the pure drug, and how much is that down to everything that is kind of interconnected with drug use. But yeah, we'll pause that one for the next Ask Me Anything, because we've got about 7 minutes left, and I've got a couple of questions that I just want to sneak in there before we disappear. I do want to read out Karen's comment though, because she said just what I'm thinking here, and that is, James, you have so much knowledge around this area, and then she's done some clappy hands, and then it's got a few likes on it, and yeah, I want to echo that. Of course, I would have said it at the end, but James, I've really enjoyed this session. I've learned stuff from this session, more than I expected, in different areas that of real interest. And you have blown me away with actually the intricate knowledge. It doesn't matter what we've brought up. You've then gone into the detail of that substance and the impacts and such like. So we'll go on to the next couple of questions. But thank you. Really, really appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us.
No, I'm glad to, Tammy. Thank you.
So a couple that I want to sneak in, and we might have to do quicker answers for these ones. But one says, if I think someone is injecting in their bedroom, what do I do?
Um, so I guess the first thing, if you thought somebody was injecting, or if you knew somebody was injecting, is going back to making sure you've got naloxone in the house. That'd be my first thing to think about. So that if something went wrong, you can intervene. So that'd be my first protocol. If somebody's injecting, and you've got concerns about that, I guess it's about approaching that and having a conversation around what's going on for them. Do they want support? What kind of support do they think they need? If somebody's injecting, I guess the first part of the conversation is to actually make sure they know what they're doing around their injecting. Are they using sterile injecting equipment? Whereabouts are they injecting? Where are they getting the injecting equipment from? Where are they getting the water from? Do they know about the other paraphernalia? Are they using citric acid or vitamin C, or are they using something dangerous like lemon juice, for example, if they're using heroin to combine those together?
James, James, I'm going to stop you there and go back to what you said at the beginning and say, have a conversation with them and then support them to go and see somebody like James. Because even that part that you've just said, whoo, citric acid, is it this? Is it, do you know?
Yeah, sorry, I went a bit in depth there. So yeah, basically, if you thought somebody was injecting, get them some help if they feel they need it, and if they don't, just make sure they're using sterile injecting equipment and knowing how to inject safely. If you're using opioids, make sure you've got naloxone and make sure they're disposing of their equipment in an appropriate way in a sharps bin. That'd be my
Yeah.
short answer.
Brilliant. Thank you, James. I think my answer that I'll add to that is actually as hard as it sometimes can be, because society has helped us become who we are. Do your best to be non-judgmental, because then they'll come and talk to you and they'll talk to you openly about it. Do you know, we've talked about stigma that is attached to different types of substances. Do you know, try and have a wider mind than that, and not be judgmental and be open and offer that conversation. Because I can remember strongly, and James, you'll be able to as well, when the message changed from drugs just say no within services to harm reduction, and understanding and prevention. And actually, the amount of people that came flooding through the doors when the message was changed, and we services opened up to have those conversations, was phenomenal to see.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm really passionate about harm reduction approaches. So recognizing that, people use drugs, we're not condemning it, we're not condoning it. We just want people to do it safely. And harm reduction is a pathway to recovery for some people as well. And that's, I guess, a really important point to say as well. So yeah, harm reduction services that can engage people and get them into treatment and give them the right support are absolutely crucial.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the last question that I had on my list, and then I think we've actually gone through everything that we were sent, is, can you truly recover from addiction? So finish us off, hopefully with a positive story that you've seen within your years.
Yeah, I think recovery is possible for anybody. Sometimes it can be really difficult. It can take a long time. Change can be incremental, and I guess we've got to recognise that some people's recovery might take a significant length of time. And I think when we talk about recovery, we've got to recognise that looks different for everybody. So we have the idea that maybe the recovery equates to abstinence for most people, but it isn't necessarily that. And I think it's really important to recognise that some people's recovery might include using substances in a non-problematic way. And I think it's really important that we don't impose or judge people's recovery from whatever problematic relationship they've had with substances. I can't even think about how many people I've seen who've gone through services who've recovered. I know there's been hundreds, if not thousands, of people who I've seen over the years who I've never seen again. I don't know what's happened to them. I don't know if they've gone away and never used substances again, or if they've gone away and maybe returned to more controlled use. But there are some people who become abstinent and choose to live that way, and there are some people who will maybe go back to a less problematic relationship whenever what part of that they were in at the time has maybe changed in their life. But yeah, it is possible for people to recover. It can be difficult, and I think when we talk about really entrenched addiction and dependency, there are huge challenges to recovery, because if you've been in a relationship with a substance for 20, 30 years, maybe longer, and that's been a significant portion of your life, along with maybe criminalization and all of those kind of other issues, moving away from that can be a huge challenge. But some people do, and we've got to recognize that. But I guess it's also important to recognize that for many people, harm reduction and recognizing that they may be using substances in a way throughout their life course, and making sure we can support them to do so in a way that's safe, is just as valid and just as important as that kind of abstinence based kind of sort of happy ever after recovery story that we all want to hear. And I've seen, but it's not always like that, unfortunately, for some people.
Yeah, and that goes back to what you said, what we said earlier about kind of actually not putting your beliefs and your frame of reference and your what you think is recovery onto somebody else, and actually supporting them like we advocate across kind of everything that we do, supporting them on their personal journey and seeing what that means specifically to them. And recognizing, like you said, that there's addiction to lots of different types of drugs. So if it's alcohol and an older person, it might be that they need, as you said, like those 4 shorter sessions. If it's a younger person, it might be diversion. If it's somebody who's been in a relationship with a drug for 30 years, then that is going to be far, far more difficult and far more complex. We have had Nina pip in right at the end. Thank you, Nina, saying, I have no, and bearing in mind we now know that she's been a probation officer since at least 2005, so she's been around a little while as well. She says, I know many wonderful people who have recovered from the depths of addiction and are now doing amazing work in helping current substance misusers make changes. And that's a wonderful thing to finish on, with that lived experience, and how, we like to try and kind of put ourselves in somebody's shoes and empathise and such like. But actually, true lived experience is really powerful, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. People who are in recovery, working within services. And I always think of a guy who I've known who's been a heroin injector for many years. And we had a lady volunteering in services who'd been a heroin injector, and she was drug free and she was volunteering. And I remember when he discovered that, and watching him listen to her experiences in a way that was, she engaged with him in a completely different way to any professional that I'd ever seen, and he was far more receptive to hearing her story and her journey and how she'd moved away from being drug free. So yeah, the power and the voice of lived experience, and centering that along with the voice of people who use drugs, is absolutely crucial in any serious discussion about drugs, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for giving us an hour of your time today. I've really enjoyed this session, learnt a lot from it. And also, I have lots and lots of comments from people saying thank you and how much they've enjoyed the session. And we'll pop it on our YouTube so other people can watch it, and we'll keep it within the Facebook group for the next couple of weeks so people can pop in there and watch it as well. If anybody wants to ask any more questions or get in touch with you or anything like that, you do have your own drug training business as well, don't you?
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks, Tammy. Yeah, so you can find Drug Train over on Facebook, over on Twitter. You can find me on Twitter as well. And yeah, please connect. Put out loads of content, interesting information around all aspects of substance use and substance misuse. So please do follow Drug Train. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, James. And thank you, everybody, for watching us today.
Thanks, Tammy.